the Odyssey webinar series. For those of you who are new to the organizational design community, I'm Panish Puranam, and I'd like to take a minute to introduce you to some of the activities in our portfolio. So the organizational design community was started approximately a decade ago as a collection of academics and practitioners whose common interest is in furthering the science and the practice of organizational design. We're a pretty broad tent kind of community. We accept people with all kinds of methodological orientation, research backgrounds, approaches to practice. The only thing you need to care about is organizational design and how to improve our practice and thinking about it. We have a flagship journal, which you might have heard of, called the Journal of Organizational Design. This is open access, so everything we publish is freely available to the world. We run an annual conference, which this year will be virtual, was virtual in 2020 and will be virtual in 2021. The topic for next year is going to be the design of platforms and ecosystems, and will be led by Professors Tobias Kretschmer at LMU and Gurnita Vasudeva at the University of Minnesota. We also have the webinar series, which is what we're doing right now. We have a great collection of teaching resources that includes cases, teaching material, but also just access to a network of experts you might want to invite as guest speakers to your classes. We run a certification program in collaboration with EODF and ODF. And finally, we've launched a very successful podcast series. So this year we completed one on making remote work, which is very topical given the big push all of us experience towards distributed collaboration. And what's coming next is a new podcast series led by Yulia Estrate on organizational resilience. So the very first episode is going to drop. Is that the word? I think that's the catchy word for podcast launch. So the next episode is going to drop in the first week with Professor Ranjay Gulati from the Harvard Business School. So if you aren't already a member, I would strongly urge you to consider becoming one. This is a very exciting and cool community, totally at the cutting edge of what's happening in org design. Today, we are very lucky to have with us Mark Lascola. So Mark, in addition to being a veteran in the area of organization design, is also an ODC board member. So it's a particular privilege to have you do this webinar, Mark. Over to you.
Anish, thank you for inviting me to spend this time with you. I want to just from a mechanics perspective, if you have questions, you can ask them as we go along, either verbally, you can certainly jump in, or you can write them into the chat box. Peter, I'm wondering, since we've been working together for so long, if you can maybe kind of keep an eye on the chat box as well, that'd be helpful, or maybe, yeah, that'd be really helpful. I appreciate it. All right. So with that said,
you need to share your screen again, Mark. So because I was still a minute ago.
One more time, finish.
You'll have to share your screen again.
Share my screen. Let's make sure I got the right one. Let me know you can see this.
And while Mark's setting that up, just a request to everybody, it would be nice if you can turn your cameras on, and there's no compulsion, but the reason we run it like a meeting instead of a webinar is precisely so we can all enjoy the joy of seeing each other's faces. So please do.
Yes, and since Zoom has added now cosmetics to their virtual background, we can make ourselves look, particularly for me, I'm not sure there's any help, but you can now enhance the looks. Tim, I can see you've already figured that one out on your virtual Zoom. Is that correct? All right. Well, let's rock and roll. Go ahead, Tim. Were you going to say something?
Sorry, it froze up right as you said Tim, so I missed the whole thing. Sorry.
Oh, got it. I was saying they now have virtual cosmetics in Zoom that you can enhance your looks.
At long last.
Exactly. Anyway, welcome everyone. I'm going to spend 90 minutes with you talking about implementation. Many of you may know my colleague and friend, Peter Turgus. We've worked together for a long, long time, and his fingerprints are all over this work that I'm about to share with you as well. So I've invited him in also to comment along the way. Just one thing I do want to say to you is the things that we're going to share with you are 30 years of in the making and are highly proprietary to On the Mark. And while I don't mind if you reference those materials, but you just remember where they came from, and that would be really helpful. It's 450 redesigns, 30 years of hard work making a solution in very practical terms. And so what I'm going to share with you are the things that we use every day in terms of implementing redesigns. So I'm going to keenly focus today on organization redesign, but focusing on implementation. And I'm trying to make there we go. Just a little bit of background on the Mark. I think I've already said it. We've been doing this work for 30 years around the globe. We have close to 450 redesigns under our belt.
Mark, I don't see the slides yet. You might need to be sure.
You're not seeing the slides, is that correct?
No.
I am having some technical difficulty this morning, but it could be user error. Let's try this. Tell me if you see this.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah, got it.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Fanish. So it gives you a little background of where we've worked and what we've done. And Peter and I have lots of scars to show for it, and hopefully we'll share with you some of our wisdoms from doing this work for pretty much our lifetime, our work lifetime. I'm going to keep us moving. Tell me if you can see the screen, Fanish. Can you still see it? This is a little bit about me. The one thing I will say to you is that I am incredibly proud of the Certified Organization Design Professional certification that the ODC has authored. Board, Tim, a number of people had their hand in this. Amy Cates, Craig had some input early on, and it's just a wonderful thing, and it's great to see that certification growing, and so I wear that badge with a lot of honor. Also, you should know I am the past founding board member and past trustee of the European Organization Design Forum, the ODI, which now Peter is actually on the board there. So we're connected to quite a number of professional organizations, just a little bit of a background. We want to really focus on implementation, and you're going to hear statements from me that are kind of maybe dramatic in nature, but I'm happy for you to call me out on that. But I want to just share a couple things. Over 50% of the projects that we go into with new clients, they may have had redesigns or restructurings happen in the last 3 to 5 years. And those restructurings many times are masquerading as redesigns. But one of the things that we find is many times those redesigns are partially implemented, but never fully implemented. And so I want to talk about today, what does full implementation require? But I'm going to hone in to 2 particular specific elements. I do want to say that partially implemented redesigns that are not fully embedded is a gift that keeps on giving in a negative kind of way. It impacts performance, it impacts engagement, and those have to be resolved when you're doing another redesign. And so the focus for today is, I'm going to point out some of the more common errors that we see when it comes to implementing redesigns. I'm going to talk about the importance of a disciplined approach during implementation, and then I'm going to hone in to one particular piece of work. And I'm going to then talk about the single greatest factor to indicating when to implement. I also have a link in this deck that you'll receive to Peter's article that he recently authored on that exact topic, which I'll kind of leave as a mystery for right now. I'll share with you some wisdoms along the way, but it would be helpful if you wouldn't mind, be helpful for me if you could either give voice to or type in a few thoughts about what would be your expectations, what would you want to walk out of here with as we spend the next 80 or so minutes together. Anyone want to give any voice to something that they'd like me to cover with regards to implementation?
There's a comment in the chat, Mark, if you want to see.
Yeah, maybe I could explain. So I'm at a design faculty at the TU Delft, and there has been some discussion for some while in design research specifically about critical notions on implementation when you have to deal with the dynamic or complex situations, or usually both. So I wonder, like for you, what is the difference between design and implementation in this case? When do you start talking about implementation? When are we not designing anymore?
Got it. I will address that. So let me give you a couple of wisdoms for us that we've learned and that we articulate, and Peter's probably channeling me at this moment. The first wisdom that we would share with you is don't confuse design with implementation. Many times during the design process itself, people will say, well, how would we do that? And then they get completely tied up. But one of the wisdoms we say is put implementation aside. We'll deal with implementation at the right time. But right now your focus is on design. What's the right design of your operating model for the business? So we make a very clear distinction between those two phases of work. There is a phase of work that then links design into implementation, and I'm going to address that in just a second. Can I ask you a small favor? Could you pronounce your first name for me? It would be really helpful for me.
Of course. Fritjof. It's a Norwegian.
Fritjof.
Fritjof, yes.
Fritjof. Okay, great. Thank you. Just appreciate it. I'll do my best. But I think it's important to call everyone by their name, and so thanks for that. Thanks for that help. That's right. So I'm interested in people. So Anne says, I'm interested in people's experience of implementing design where the espoused theory is that implementation will be agnostic of incumbents, but in reality, that's not how it happens. So Anne, can I put you on the spot to just give us a little bit more context to that?
Sure. Hi, Mark. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, I think it's something I encounter all the time where, just as you've alluded to there, you know, we say, well, let's not focus on implementation. People think of all the but, and we go, let's just get the design right and go from there when we get to implementation. But then you get there and you've got a lot of kind of protection of incumbents in roles where we've done a design that is designed to deliver, you know, strategy or whatever we set out to do, whatever problem we started out to solve, but then we go to implement and there's a huge resistance to upsetting the apple cart in terms of the people who exist today and what that design might mean for them.
Well, there's two things I would say to you, Anne, about that. And then here's our wisdom is if you're encountering resistance to change, you haven't done the change work properly along the way, or it hasn't been done. So one of the things that has to happen, and we're going to get to readiness, you're going to hear this, is if you, well, let me just proceed forward here. Let me go to the common implementation errors, and particularly is if you're passing off to change management at implementation, you're already too late and you're going to encounter resistance. And the resistance to that change is typically a lagging indicator that basically says how you've done this work is what we call sub-optimized. You've done a sub-optimized design, taking a term from socio-technical systems. And so why don't you wait? I'm going to come back to that, and when we get to readiness, and Peter and I will expand on that quite dramatically. But one of the things to think about, the wisdom we share, is pay now or pay later.
Sure.
And if you don't do that change work way up front, then you end up getting what you got, which is that reluctance and resistance. And we'll come back to that. Peter, do you want to throw anything in there before I keep going?
No, Mark, I think I know what you've got coming, so I'll stay.
All right. So you can read these common implementation errors. One of the things I want to emphasize is that moving people into jobs is really the easy part of implementation. And it's usually overly focused on, but it is not implementation. It's a small part of implementation, and it's the easiest part. I've already talked about an incomplete design, and I'll share with you what I mean by that. Also, avoid a traditional project management approach to implementation. What do you think I mean by that? Avoid a traditional project management approach to implementation? What do you think we're aiming at there? And this is not a dig or a slight at project managers, because they're much needed. Stephen, what do you think I mean by that? Stephen Leduc.
Well, my reaction to it, Mark, is more from a change management perspective, that maybe a traditional project management approach is limited to a few, and there's maybe an iterative development process. Whereas on the implementation side, you're going to involve a lot more others in the execution implementation of the work. And you're going to follow a little bit more of an agile and concurrent approach as opposed to an iterative approach.
Yes, okay. Yeah, let me give you a high five for your genius. So it's exactly right, which is staying overly focused on task, schedule, milestones, misses the point of implementation. And we avoid any terms, and this comes back to you, your question, which is we never talk about going live with a new design when we start to implement. You can use the word launch, or Amy Cates wrote about activation, two good words, and I'll share with you why that is. Many times we leave teams to struggle at the time when it's the last thing we should do is leave teams unsupported in the new operating model. So going hands off at implementation is one of the worst things that you could do. And this ties into behavior, this ties into neuroscience. For those of you who like the neuroscience and change work, which is, we know patterns die hard, right? Our brains love patterns. And until you replace old patterns with new patterns of work, right? The worst thing you can do is just let people get on with it, because when they're unsure, and I'm going to show you the science, they'll default to what they know. And what they know may be completely counter to what the new operating model is. And the last thing is not measuring this thing called stabilization. And I'm going to share with you what that means in just a second. If you want more information, here's a little bit more from a Forbes article on what is critical to successful execution, but I'm going to drive out of that, but this will be in the slides. So let me talk with you about something about everybody who does design work has cycles and phases and has a star model and things like that. One of the things that our phases have that most phases don't is our methodology, our solution has a decision tree from start to finish, the decisions that have to be made in a critical pathing order. And every one of our phases has a psychological purpose as well as a technical purpose that has to be achieved before moving to the next phase. So in many ways, we can apply an agile process to our design process, but before moving to next phases, there has to be a stage gate to make sure that we've achieved what we need to achieve, including stakeholder support. For those of you who've ever done a redesign, a functional redesign or a business unit redesign, or even an enterprise-wide redesign, you know that there's a significant amount of interdependencies, and that those interdependencies connect with other departments, units, teams, boards. Those all have to be socialized, and making sure that leaders have the support that they need, and the stakeholders are lined up to support the new operating model, whatever that is. Now, the reason I share this with you is I want to highlight that each one of these phases is interdependent on the other phases of work. And I want to then call your attention to the implementation to stabilization phase. So we don't just call it implementation. We deliberately call it implementation through stabilization, because those are not the same things. Fritjof, this is your question. I think that, so when we go into implementation, our designs are never more than 75% complete. And this is a critical piece, because you're basically implementing a living dynamic work system. It's not a machine. And so your question about when is design done? Well, design is really from a continuous improvement.